For centuries, the Osage people moved with the land. They were once among the most powerful tribes in North America, their influence stretching from the Great Lakes to the Great Plains. But as the United States expanded, so did its relentless hunger for land, forcing the Osage westward. Again and again, they were pushed from their ancestral homes, their lands taken through broken treaties and government coercion. By the 1870s, they had been forced onto a seemingly barren reservation in northeastern Oklahoma, a land thought to be of little value, a final place where they could be forgotten. But beneath that land lay something extraordinary. Oil. And not just small pockets of it, but an ocean of crude bubbling beneath the rolling prairie, waiting to be tapped. In a stunning twist of fate, the Osage people, who had been stripped of nearly everything, became the wealthiest people per capita in the world. White prospectors swarmed to Osage County, desperate to lease drilling rights. The Osage had negotiated a rare and powerful clause in their agreement with the U.S. government. The mineral rights to their land could never be sold, only inherited. This meant that every barrel of oil pumped from the ground generated money directly into the pockets of the Osage Nation. The money was staggering. By the 1920s, Osage headrights, shares in the oil profits, were worth millions. Lavish mansions rose in the middle of the Oklahoma plains. The Osage rode in chauffeured cars, sent their children to prestigious schools, and wore the finest clothing money could buy. Some traveled to Europe, where they were treated like royalty. The newspapers called them the richest people in the world. But to others, they were something else entirely, an opportunity, a problem that needed solving, a people too rich for their own good. Because there was one undeniable truth in early 20th century America. Wealth, in the hands of native people, was never tolerated for long, and soon a darkness began creeping over Osage County, a slow, deliberate erasure. One by one, Osage people started dying. Some were shot, some were poisoned, others simply vanished, their bodies never found. At first, the deaths seemed like tragic coincidences. Then, patterns emerged. Entire families were being wiped out. The official reports offered vague explanations: wasting illness, accidental poisoning, suicide. But within the Osage community, a terrible realization set in. This was not misfortune. This was murder. And the killers? They walked freely among them. This is the true story behind Killers of the Flower Moon, a story of greed, betrayal, and a government that turned a blind eye until it was too late. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling details of America's most sinister conspiracy. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, if you believe history should never be buried, subscribe now. Because what happened to the Osage was not an isolated crime. It was a warning, one that echoes across time. Wealth, in America, has always come with power. But for the Osage, wealth came with something else: control. A system designed not to protect them, but to strip them of their independence under the guise of law. It was called the guardianship system, and it was one of the most insidious weapons used against the Osage people. Under this law, full-blooded Osage were deemed incompetent to manage their own finances, regardless of education, intelligence, or experience. White men, often local businessmen, politicians, and even those who called themselves friends of the Osage, were appointed as their guardians. In theory, a guardian was meant to help manage the Osage's wealth responsibly. In reality, they were nothing more than legal thieves. These men controlled every dollar an Osage could spend. Want a new car? Permission was required. Need medical treatment? Approval had to be given. Even basic necessities like food and clothing had to be requested from a guardian, who had no obligation to grant them. The system was riddled with abuse. Guardians overcharged for simple services, stole money outright, and denied their wards access to their own fortunes. Some Osage people were forced to live in poverty, while their white guardians flourished, growing rich off the money they had siphoned. Government oversight was non-existent. When complaints were made, they were ignored or laughed off. One Osage woman, unable to access her own wealth, wrote a desperate letter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, begging for relief. She was suffering, starving, while her guardian lived comfortably off her fortune. The response? Silence. The theft was happening in broad daylight. It was legal, it was structured, and it was just the beginning. Because for some, stealing money wasn't enough. They wanted it all. And there was only one way to ensure that an Osage fortune changed hands permanently: murder. The deaths started as whispers. Isolated incidents, a shooting here, a mysterious illness there. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. Osage families were being erased, their wealth transferring into the hands of their white guardians, spouses, and associates. The Osage people were being systematically killed, and the very system designed to protect them was enabling their destruction. The question was no longer if something sinister was happening in Osage County. It was who was behind it. And just how deep did the conspiracy go? At first, the death seemed random. A gunshot victim found on the side of the road. A woman who went to bed feeling fine but never woke up. A man who wasted away, doctors unable or unwilling to determine the cause. But for the Osage, these were not isolated tragedies. They were warnings. The first to die was Anna Brown, a vibrant Osage woman known for her bold personality and love of life. She was last seen leaving a dance hall in May of 1921. Days later, her body was discovered in a ravine outside Pawhuska, Oklahoma. A single gunshot wound to the head. Execution style. The official ruling? Alcohol-related death. Never mind that a bullet had torn through her skull. Never mind that no one in law enforcement seemed interested in finding out who pulled the trigger. The case was closed before it had even begun. Then came Lizzie Q, an older Osage woman with a fortune in oil headrights. One by one, her daughters started dying. Some from what doctors called a wasting disease, others from sudden, unexplained illnesses. It was as if an invisible hand was wiping out her family, taking them from her one by one. Then, Lizzie herself fell ill. Her once strong frame weakened overnight. Her skin turned sallow. Her eyes became hollow. Within weeks, she was dead. The cause? Officially, a natural illness, but those close to her suspected poison. The deaths continued. A young Osage man shot while riding in his car. No suspects. No arrests. A family found lifeless in their home, their food and water laced with something undetectable. No investigation. No justice. Then a house exploded in the middle of the night, the fire lighting up the Oklahoma sky. Inside were Rita Smith, her husband, and their white housekeeper. All three were killed instantly. The explosion was so powerful that neighbors found body parts strewn across the yard. Once again, law enforcement dismissed the case. The coroner claimed it must have been an accident. The oil-rich soil of Osage County soaked up yet another crime. But within the Osage Nation, fear spread like wildfire. People spoke in hushed tones. Trusted friends turned into suspects. Osage men and women lay awake at night, knowing their names could be next on the growing list of the dead. The killers weren't lurking in the shadows. They weren't bandits or outlaws riding in from the prairie. They were neighbors, doctors, businessmen, husbands, friends, and no one, not the police, not the government, not the courts, was coming to save them. Molly Burkhart never saw the storm coming. Not at first. She was Osage, born into a life of wealth that should have guaranteed safety. Married to a white man named Ernest Burkhart, she believed she had found stability in a world that seemed increasingly dangerous for her people. She lived in a fine home, she dressed in elegant gowns. She was respected, protected, or so she thought. One by one, the people closest to her began dying. The first was her sister, Anna Brown, bold, fearless, and defiant. The kind of woman who spoke her mind, perhaps too loudly, perhaps to the wrong people. When she was found with a bullet lodged in her skull, it was ruled a drunken accident. But Molly knew better. Then another sister, Rita Smith, was killed in a fiery explosion that reduced her home to rubble. The blast was so powerful that pieces of the house were found a quarter-mile away. The authorities barely investigated. Another Osage death, another shrug from the men who were supposed to uphold the law. But the terror wasn't over. Molly's mother, Lizzie Q, had been strong and full of life. But suddenly, inexplicably, she began wasting away. Her skin grew pale, her body weakened. She complained of stomach pains, fatigue, nausea. The local doctors, all white, called it natural causes, a bad diet, a flu, old age. But the Osage whispered a different word: poison. And they were right. Molly could only watch as her mother's health deteriorated day by day until the inevitable came. Lizzie Q was gone, another Osage matriarch erased, another fortune passed down. And who was left to inherit the wealth? Molly, alone, devastated, but still standing, and more valuable than ever. As she buried her mother, she couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. Death was circling her family like a vulture, picking them off one by one, and she was next in line. But Molly wasn't just afraid, she was sick. Over the months, she had grown increasingly weak, her body betraying her. She suffered from relentless fatigue, nausea, dizzy spells. She could no longer eat, she could barely stand. She was dying, slowly, quietly, and no one, not the police, not the doctors, not even her husband, seemed concerned. Molly didn't know it yet, but her illness was no accident. The same poison that had stolen her mother and sisters was now coursing through her own veins. And the man sleeping beside her, the one who had promised to protect her, was not the man she thought he was. She was living with the enemy. The question was, would she figure it out before it was too late? The night of March 10th, 1923, was still and quiet in Fairfax, Oklahoma. The prairie air was thick and the town had settled into sleep. But then, a thunderous explosion shattered the silence. The blast was so powerful it could be heard for miles. A fiery glow lit up the night sky as a home was ripped apart in an instant. Rita Smith, Molly Burkhart's sister, had been inside, along with her husband, Bill Smith, and their white housekeeper, Nettie Brookshire. By the time neighbors rushed to the scene, the house was nothing but burning wreckage. The heat was unbearable. Debris smoldered across the yard. The force of the explosion had flung pieces of the house in every direction, and in the center of the devastation, human remains lay scattered among the ruins. Rita and Nettie were killed instantly. Bill, somehow, was still alive, barely. His body was broken, skin charred, eyes swollen shut. He clung to life for days in a hospital bed, his face barely recognizable. But before he could name who had done this, before he could reveal the truth, he died. The official explanation? A gas leak, an accident, nothing more. But the Osage knew better. This was not chance, this was not fate, this was a message. And that message was clear. No one was safe. The explosion was the loudest crime yet, but it was not the first. Osage men and women had been dying for years, one by one, in mysterious, silent deaths. A bullet in the night, a sudden illness, a body disappearing into the prairie. The pattern was undeniable. But this was different. This was not quiet. This was not subtle. This was an act of terror, meant to send a warning to the entire Osage Nation. We can take everything from you, and no one will stop us. The local law enforcement did exactly what they had always done. Nothing. No serious investigation. No suspects brought in for questioning. No effort to find out who had planted the bomb that obliterated Rita Smith's home. And so the murders continued. More Osage died. More families were destroyed. More fortunes changed hands, and the killers, they were walking freely in the streets, shaking hands, smiling, laughing. Because they believed one thing, no one was coming to save the Osage. And for a while, they were right. Fairfax, Oklahoma was not a city in chaos. It was not a place of outlaws hiding in the shadows. No, the murderers of the Osage walked openly among their victims. They attended church. They ran businesses. They tipped their hats in polite greetings as they passed Osage men and women on the street, some of whom they had already marked for death. And the town? The town remained silent. No one asked questions. No one demanded justice. White store owners, bankers, and lawmen all knew what was happening. How could they not? The Osage were dying too frequently, too conveniently, their wealth transferring into the hands of white guardians, white spouses, white friends. But Fairfax had been built on a foundation of greed, and in this town, silence had a price. Those who did speak up, who whispered suspicions, who dared to ask why the Osage were dropping dead, often found themselves facing a choice. Keep quiet, or end up buried in the Oklahoma dirt. One man, a white oil worker named Henry Roan, had been friends with many Osage. He was known to drink with them, laugh with them, share their company. But one day, his body was found slumped over in his car, a bullet lodged in his head. The investigation? There was none. His death was ruled a suicide, even though the bullet had entered from an angle that made it physically impossible for him to have pulled the trigger himself. And then there was W. Vaughn, a lawyer, one of the few white men in town who had openly tried to help the Osage. He had gathered evidence, names, documents, proof of forged wills, shady financial dealings, suspicious deaths. He had planned to expose it all. One night, Vaughn received a phone call. A man on the other end of the line had urgent information. something that could break the case wide open. Vaughn rushed out of his house into the darkness. He was never seen alive again. Days later, his body was found dumped along the railroad tracks. His skull had been bashed in. His evidence? Gone. And so, the message was clear. This was not just a series of murders. This was a conspiracy. The town of Fairfax was no longer a place of law and order. It was a hunting ground, a machine built to strip the Osage of everything, slowly, methodically, without consequence. The killers had grown bold. They had no fear. Because who would stop them? Molly Burkhart was running out of family. Her sister, Anna Brown, was shot in the head. Her sister, Rita Smith, was blown to pieces in her own home. Her mother, Lizzie Q, had withered away under mysterious illness. And now she herself was sick, her body weakening, her strength fading, her life slipping away for no apparent reason. Fear had become her constant companion. She knew she was being watched. Eyes followed her wherever she went in Fairfax. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. The silence of the town was suffocating. The people who smiled at her in public, the shopkeepers, the lawyers, the lawmen, she could no longer trust them. Were they part of it? Did they know? Even her own husband, Ernest Burkhart, the man who shared her bed, the man who comforted her after her family's deaths, he was white. He was connected to men in power, and yet he never seemed truly afraid. Had he been mourning with her? Or watching her? Molly felt trapped. Every Osage was trapped. If she stayed silent, more would die. If she spoke up, she could be next. The law was useless. The local sheriff barely lifted a finger. The coroner continued signing off deaths as suicides, accidents, or illnesses, no matter how suspicious the circumstances. But Molly was desperate. She turned to the one place left, the federal government. Molly and a few surviving Osage leaders sent a plea to Washington, D.C. They begged for an investigation, for someone outside of Oklahoma to look into the reign of terror that had already stolen so many lives. And for the first time, there was an answer. A young agency, one that had recently begun handling complex cases, took notice. It was an organization still finding its footing, but one that had the resources and manpower that local law enforcement lacked. It was called the Bureau of Investigation, later known as the FBI. And the man leading the case? A rising star named J. Edgar Hoover. Molly didn't know it yet, but her decision had just set something in motion. Something big. Because for the first time, the murderers of the Osage would face something they had never encountered before. Someone who couldn't be bought. The killers had grown comfortable. For years, they had poisoned, shot, and blown up the Osage with impunity. They had stolen millions, rewritten wills, and erased entire bloodlines, all under the protection of silence. But in 1923, something changed. Strangers began arriving in Fairfax. They weren't cowboys or oilmen. They weren't looking to buy land or negotiate head rights. They were federal agents, sent by the Bureau of Investigation, and they weren't here to be bought. J. Edgar Hoover, a young, ambitious bureaucrat in Washington, had taken an interest in the case. He saw the Osage Murders as a chance to prove the power of his newly structured bureau, a chance to show that law and order could reach even the darkest corners of America. But Hoover didn't trust the local authorities. He didn't trust the Oklahoma courts or the corrupt politicians who had allowed the murders to go unchecked. He needed outsiders, men who could blend in, ask questions, and dig where others wouldn't dare. So he sent Tom White, a former Texas Ranger, to lead the investigation. White was everything Hoover wasn't: rugged, quiet, a man of the frontier who had spent years chasing outlaws. He was no politician. He wasn't concerned with paperwork or headlines. He was a hunter. White carefully selected a team of undercover agents. They were former lawmen, cowboys, even an American Indian agent. They arrived disguised, one as a cattle buyer, another as an insurance salesman, another posing as an oil prospector. They walked the streets of Fairfax, drinking in the same bars as the men they were investigating, sitting in the same barber shops, listening, watching. And the deeper they looked, the worse the picture became. The Osage weren't just being murdered for their wealth. They were being systematically erased, their deaths covered up, their inheritances manipulated, their entire existence treated as a resource to be extracted by white men who saw them as obstacles, not people. And one name kept coming up again and again: William King Hale. On the surface, Hale was a respected businessman. He had built a fortune in Osage County. He presented himself as a friend of the Osage, a man who supported their interests, attended their funerals, and spoke kindly of them in public. But behind closed doors, the truth was far darker. He was not just involved in the killings, he was orchestrating them. And he wasn't working alone. The Bureau had uncovered something much larger than a few isolated murders. They had stumbled upon a criminal empire, one that stretched into the courts, the banks, the hospitals, an entire system designed to strip the Osage of everything, built by men who had spent years perfecting their methods. The investigation had begun. The killers were being watched. But they weren't going down without a fight, because Fairfax wasn't just a town with secrets. It was a town willing to kill to keep them buried. For years, William King Hale had operated without fear. He wasn't just another wealthy cattleman, he was the self-proclaimed king of Osage County. He controlled the banks, the courts, the police. He funded elections, paid off judges, and decided who lived and who died. And for the longest time it worked. No one dared to challenge him. Not the law, not the government, not even the Osage themselves. He was untouchable. Until now. As Tom White and his Bureau agents dug deeper, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The murders of the Osage weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic, planned, and at the center of it all was Hale. White and his men traced financial records, discovered forged wills, and followed the flow of Osage wealth, all of it leading straight to Hale's associates, his family, and his loyal network of killers. But they needed more than suspicions. They needed witnesses. And that was a problem, because in Osage County, witnesses had a habit of disappearing. The few who had spoken up in the past were now dead, shot, poisoned, or found in shallow graves. Others, knowing the fate that awaited them, stayed silent. Even Ernest Burkhart, Molly's husband, Hale's own nephew, had refused to speak. He remained by Molly's side, playing the part of the grieving, loyal husband. But White knew better. He could see it in his eyes. Ernest was hiding something, but breaking him would take time. In the meantime, White needed someone else. Someone with enough knowledge of Hale's operations, someone scared enough or desperate enough to turn against him. And so, the agents turned their attention to a man named John Ramsey, a known criminal, a hired gun who had worked for Hale in the past. They cornered him, applied pressure, and finally, he cracked. Ramsey confessed that he had been directly involved in at least one of the Osage murders, the murder of Henry Roan. Roan, an Osage man, had been found dead in his car with a bullet in his head. The local authorities had written it off as a drunken suicide. But now, the truth was coming out. Hale had ordered the hit, and Ramsey had been the trigger man. The first crack in Hale's empire had formed, and Tom White was going to break it wide open. Because now, the Bureau had a confession, and they were coming for the man who thought he could never be caught. For weeks, Tom White had been circling the man who held the key to everything, Ernest Burkhart. Ernest wasn't just another player in this deadly game. He was Molly Burkhart's husband, yet the man who had comforted her as her family was picked off one by one. The man who had sworn to love her, to protect her. But he was also William Hale's nephew. And now, Tom White had to make him choose between those two loyalties. At first, Ernest refused to talk. He insisted he knew nothing. He swore he was innocent. But the evidence was closing in. White had already gotten a confession from John Ramsey, who had tied Hale to the murder of Henry Roan. The Bureau had also uncovered fraudulent insurance claims, policies taken out on dead Osage, all linked back to Hale's network. And then there was Molly. By now, Molly was gravely ill, poisoned. White's agents discovered that her very own doctor, a white physician who had sworn to care for the Osage, had been slowly poisoning her. Day by day, dose by dose, he had been ensuring that she wouldn't live long enough to ask questions. And who had arranged for this doctor to treat her? Ernest. White confronted him with the truth. For the first time, Ernest Burkhart's carefully built wall of silence began to crack. His hands shook, his voice wavered. He looked around as if expecting someone, his uncle perhaps, to come and save him. But no one did. Hale had always promised Ernest that he would protect him, that nothing would ever touch them. But now, Ernest was alone. And then came the final blow. Tom White made a promise of his own: if Ernest didn't confess, he would hang. Slowly, painfully, Ernest broke down. He slumped in his chair. his eyes filled with tears, and then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said it. We did it. With those 3 words, the entire conspiracy began to unravel. Ernest admitted that Hale had orchestrated everything. The poisonings, the bombings, the gunmen in the night, all of it was his uncle's doing. Hale had carefully built a network of killers, enforcers, and corrupt officials to carry out his plan. He had arranged marriages between Osage women and white men under his control, ensuring that their wealth would legally pass to his people once the Osage were gone. And the worst part? Ernest had helped him. He had watched as his wife's family was slaughtered, knowing the truth all along. The confession shook Osage County to its core. The king of Osage County, William King Hale, was no longer untouchable, because now the law was coming for him. For years, William King Hale had played God in Osage County. He had decided who lived, who died, and who inherited the wealth of the murdered Osage. He had bribed lawmen, controlled judges, and laughed in the face of justice. But now, justice had come knocking. With Ernest Burkhart's confession, the Bureau of Investigation had everything they needed. Hale was no longer just a suspect, he was the mastermind, the architect of one of the most sinister crimes in American history. And yet when Tom White and his agents arrived to arrest him, Hale did not run. He did not fight, he did not beg. Instead he smiled, because he still believed he would win. After all, this was Oklahoma. This was Osage County. This was his kingdom. He had been arrested before, questioned before. Nothing had ever come of it. He had the money, the power, and the connections to walk away from any crime, no matter how brutal. So as the agents led him away, Hale remained confident. Because he had one last trick up his sleeve: the courtroom. Hale knew that trials in Oklahoma had always been stacked in favor of men like him. Juries were white, judges were white, and Osage lives had never been worth much in the eyes of the law. And so, as the case went to trial, Hale played the role of the respectable cattleman, the kind, generous businessman who had been falsely accused. His lawyers worked tirelessly to undermine the case. They called witnesses who swore Hale was a man of integrity. They questioned the Bureau's evidence, suggested that Ernest Burkhart's confession had been coerced. They whispered to the jury that this was all a misunderstanding, that the Osage had simply fallen victim to unfortunate circumstances. And at first, it seemed to be working. The first trial ended in a hung jury, a deadlock, a delay, exactly what Hale wanted. But J. Edgar Hoover would not allow this case to slip away, not this time. He sent federal prosecutors back to Osage County, determined to win. The Bureau brought forth overwhelming evidence, confessions, financial records, signed testimonies, proving beyond any doubt that Hale had orchestrated the murders. And this time, the jury could not ignore the truth. William King Hale was found guilty. His empire crumbled, his power evaporated, and the self-proclaimed king of Osage County was sentenced to life in prison. But was it justice? For the Osage, the wounds ran too deep. The land was still stained with blood. The fortune Hale had stolen would never be fully recovered. The families he had destroyed would never be made whole again. And worst of all, many others had gotten away with it. Hale may have fallen, but the system he had exploited, the corruption, the greed, the cold indifference to Osage lives still remained. And for the Osage Nation, the scars of this reign of terror would never fully heal. William King Hale had been sentenced. His empire of death had crumbled. The headlines proclaimed it a victory. Justice had been served. But the Osage knew better. Because for every Hale that was convicted, there were dozens more who had escaped. Doctors who had prescribed poison under the guise of medicine. Lawyers who had forged wills, ensuring white inheritors took Osage wealth. Bankers who had approved fraudulent transfers, emptying accounts of the dead. Politicians who had looked the other way, accepting bribes to keep the bloodshed quiet. Few of them ever saw a jail cell. Many lived long, comfortable lives, spending the money they had stolen. Some even became pillars of the community, respected men, honored at church, spoken of fondly in history books. And what of the Osage? The survivors, like Molly Burkhart, had to keep living in the ruins of a massacre. Molly had barely escaped with her life. She had been poisoned, her body weakened, her trust shattered. She had loved a man who had conspired to kill her. And yet, she endured. She divorced Ernest Burkhart, left behind the pieces of her stolen family, and tried to rebuild. But how do you rebuild when everything, your blood, your wealth, your very existence, had been targeted for erasure? The Osage never stopped fighting. Years later in Washington, they would stand before the U.S. Congress, telling their story, demanding protections. The government was forced to acknowledge what had happened in Osage County, a crime so vast, so deeply rooted in greed and racial exploitation that it stood as one of the darkest chapters in American history. But no amount of government reform could erase what had already been lost. And so, the Osage held on to their history, not as a story of victimhood, but as a warning. A truth that could not be buried. Because for them this was not just history, it was survival. And in a world that had tried to erase them, they were still here. Years passed. The trials faded from the newspapers. William King Hale, the so-called King of Osage County, sat behind bars, but time was kind to him. Too kind. Hale's life sentence? It didn't last. Despite masterminding one of the most sinister crimes in American history, Hale was paroled after serving just over 2 decades. In 1947, he walked free, living out his final years as a quiet old man in Arizona, a man who had ordered the deaths of entire Osage families and suffered little for it. And he wasn't the only one. Many of his accomplices lived normal lives after the trials. Some reinvented themselves. Some were never caught at all. Justice, as the Osage had always known, was selective. The system had never been built for them. Meanwhile, the Osage Nation carried the weight of their stolen past. The oil boom had faded. The wealth that had once made them targets had drained away into the hands of white guardians, corrupt businessmen, and the very people who had murdered their families. But the Osage endured. They refused to let their history become a forgotten tragedy. They spoke of it, they taught their children, they passed down the names of the lost, making sure no one could erase them. For decades, the world ignored their story, and then, nearly a century later, something changed. A book, a film, a reckoning. David Grann's Killers of the Flower Moon brought the Osage Murders back into the public eye. It forced a new generation to confront the horrors of what had been done. Hollywood turned the story into a film, spreading the Osage's history to millions. And yet, no amount of attention could undo what had been lost. The Osage Murders were not an isolated tragedy. They were part of something bigger, a pattern, a system, a way of taking. The theft of Osage lives was not just about money. It was about power, about who gets to write history, about who is allowed to survive. But the Osage did survive, and they never stopped telling their story. Because some crimes should never be buried. Some truths must always be remembered. The Osage Murders were not just a crime. They were a warning, a brutal reminder of how easily power, greed, and corruption could turn entire communities into hunting grounds. How a nation built on stolen land could still find new ways to steal. For the Osage people, the wounds have never fully healed. Families were shattered. Generations lost their inheritance, not just in wealth, but in stories, in traditions, in trust. The descendants of the victims still carry the weight of that history, a history that almost disappeared. Because for decades, this story was buried. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't spoken of in textbooks. The killers, those who got away with it, were allowed to fade into quiet, comfortable lives. And yet, the Osage refused to let their past be erased. They fought to keep their history alive, so that no one could ever claim it didn't happen. So that the world would have to remember, so that no people, anywhere, would suffer the same fate. And now, you know the truth. You know the depths of the betrayal. You know the cruelty that was hidden behind handshakes and legal documents. You know the names of those who took everything from the Osage, and you know the names of those who refused to be silenced. This story is not just about the past. It is about what we choose to remember. It is about who we choose to believe. And if stories like this matter to you, if the truth matters, then make sure it is never forgotten. Subscribe now for more stories that history tried to erase, because some crimes may be buried, but their ghosts never rest, and neither should we.